Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual Proustian rencontre presented by Albertine Bookstore. My name is Gaëtan Bruel, and I am the cultural counselor here at the Cultural Services of the French Embassy. And it is truly my esteemed pleasure to welcome Jean-Yves Tadié and Caroline Weber here to discuss and celebrate two landmark events concerning this most remarkable of 20th century French authors, the Gallimard publication of what many consider the Proustian Holy Grail, the 1908 75 Feuillet, and the publication of the Proust issue in the distinguished Cahiers de L'Herne series, which was overseen by Mr. Tadié. Before, in 1 minute, I give the floor to our two exceptional guests, I wanted to take the opportunity to briefly introduce them. A dear friend of Albertine and the Cultural Services, Caroline Weber is the author of Terror and its Discontents, Suspect Words in Revolutionary France, Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, a New York Times notable book and a Washington Post Best Book of the Year, and Proust Duchess, How Three Celebrated Women Captured the Imagination of Fin-de-Siècle Paris, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the American Library of Paris Book Prize, and the winner of the French Heritage Society Literary Award. She is currently at work on a sequel to Proust Duchess, a study of art and aristocratic society in Paris from the Dreyfus Affair to the end of World War I. Caroline Weber is professor of French and comparative literature at Barnard College. Welcome, Caroline. In conversation with Professor Weber, we have the privilege of welcoming one of France's most renowned academics, and I must say a true legend for all French students, Jean-Yves Tadié. A graduate of the École Normale Supérieure, Tadié was a professor at the Sorbonne and director of the collections Classical Folio and Theatre Folio at Gallimard. Between 1987 and 1989, he edited the 4-volume Pléiade edition of À la recherche du temps perdu. And in 1996, he published his landmark eponymous biography of Marcel Proust, still considered to this day to be definitive. Outside of France, Jean-Yves Tadié was director of the French Institute in London and also a fellow and member of the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages at Oxford, as well as a faculty member at universities abroad in Yaoundé, Alexandria, and Cairo. Jean-Yves Tadié has been a commander in the Order of Arts and Letters since 2011, and he is vice president of the Société des Amis de Marcel Proust. Monsieur Tadié, bienvenue. Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you also to Sandrine, Adam, and Myriam, Albertine's team. And I hope you enjoy today's conversation about the great, the unique, our beloved Marcel Proust.
Thank you, Gaëtan, for having us here today. And thank you everyone at Albertine, as always. This is a really, really exciting session because of the legend that we are able to talk with today about the legend Marcel Proust. And I wanted to start just by asking you, I've never met Professor Tadié before today. And I wanted to start out just by saying, first of all, that in this volume, we thought we might start by talking first about this volume of documents about Proust from L'Herne that has just come out in France, and then talking about the 75 pages of Proust, the Holy Grail. But you start your essay, your collection for L'Herne with a really beautiful essay, Professor Tadié. And one of the lines that you wrote that I really liked and I thought might frame what we start to talk about first in this edition is à chaque fois Proust est différent, 50 masques pour un seul visage. Every time Proust is different, 50 masks for one single face. That's of course based on a quote from Proust himself, but I kept thinking while reading these documents in your anthology for L'Herne, how many faces of Proust we got to see through the selections that you made. Could you talk to us a little bit about the kinds of documents that are included in the different sections of this book, and why and how you chose them, and what faces of Proust we can see because of them?
Thank you very much. I was thinking beginning the bookshop Albertine, very happy to be there without having to take any plane. And then in that cahier, there are three kinds of texts. First ones, very classically, are unpublished materials from the famous Cahiers de Brouillon and some letters, one quite fascinating about the meaning of a melody written to his great friend René de Haan. After the unpublished material, there are some, I wanted to republish forgotten or unknown documents, testimonies, memories, souvenirs, written by very good friends of his, who had been generally well-known figures in the 20s and the 30s, and generally, unfortunately, forgotten after the Second World War, from France, but also from England mostly, because, well, I don't think he had met many American except Walter Beery, which is a great figure of the American for Americans in Paris during the war and after. And then after those memories or documents, which had been published in unknown papers or more known papers or in some review, come a series of articles, either from French or foreign academics about Proust, or also from writers, authors, who were not academics, but gave their experiment, try to express their love. And the general theme was, in my view, the word and, because I thought of a very fine moment in Wagner's Tristan and Isolde about that little word hand. Yeah. And I think it's Isolde who is singing that. I won't do it tonight because my voice is not so good as before. And then it's ce petit mot et qui exprime Tristan et Isolde, that small word et and which expresses all what we are. And I thought that the link between Proust and us would be all included in that small word and. So it's Proust et moi, Proust et Gérard Massé, or Pierre Bergogneau, or Proust et also every writer can be quoted, but we try to show the links between Proust and some writers like less well-known, or like Gobineau, for instance, or Michelet, and so on, by scholars of those specialists of those authors. So you have also a special section of comparative literature. Yeah. So I think everybody can find his pleasure in some part of that huge book. There are 63 contributors. Many are ghosts or are dead, but some are very well alive.
And did you have, yeah, I love this idea of just the word "and" as the guiding structural principle for this volume. And because, you know, one of the other things I think you say in your opening essay is, and you're again referencing a famous image in Proust of him wanting his book to be an optical instrument where we read ourselves instead of reading him. And you say, we write about Proust because he wrote about us. You know, so having all of these people weigh in on his achievement from different perspectives is really, it's a wonderful, wonderful experience to read this book. It has that kaleidoscope effect that we see in the Recherche. I know it's like asking a person probably to choose their favorite child of many children, but are there particular essays that you were struck by or rediscoveries that you made in publishing documents that you hadn't looked at in a long time? What are some of your highlights from this collection?
I like very much, for instance, my cousin Marcel Proust by Valentine Thompson, which was published in English in Vogue, I think in the 20s. I thought it was extremely interesting. Also, the interview, the Céline Cochin. Céline Cochin was a former Françoise, one of the numerous models of the old maid before Céleste Albaret. So it was just before Céleste Albaret. It was very interesting to compare. And I was also very much interested by the first interviews with Céleste before her book, because one could see that she was saying the same thing alone that she later said to Georges Belmont, who was the writer of her book, and a very nasty figure, by the way. But yes, well, under another name, he was a great collaborator.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh no.
It's not our subject, but it was a paradox. And so the Celeste piece was also very good, and also Reynaldo Hahn, because there is, for me, a great mystery. The silence of Proust about Reynaldo and the silence of Reynaldo about Proust. Everybody knows that they had a great love affair during 2 years, which was, by the way, much for Proust, because, as he said, with me, it lasts only 18 months. And so 2 years was already...
he broke his record.
And then he swept to Lucien Audet, as you know. And well, every day of the year, Reynaldo Hahn used to pay a visit to Proust, where he was not too sick to open his door to him. And then those two men, Reynaldo Hahn has written a very small piece in the homage of the Nouvelle Revue Française in January 1923, which was issued, as you know, 6 weeks after Proust's death. And then that piece we give here, the second article was, I think, completely unknown. So I was happy to publish it. And I think also the diary of Harold Nicholson, Vita Saguiro's husband, a very strange husband too. And he has in his diary spoken of Proust in a very funny way, very interesting, because it was very queer and odd and very funny way of seeing him. And also among the discoveries, there was also the piece of Gustave Roussy. As you know, Gustave Roussy is a very famous cancerologist, and was Swiss. And I discovered he was Proust's cousin. And in 1943, he published in the Gazette de Lausanne, nobody could read in France because of the war, the occupation, a piece about my cousin Marcel Proust. And my friend Julien Boguskowski gave me the tip, and we could find the article and publish it. So it was a lot of discovery or of adventure, seeking for unknown pieces about Proust, not generally from academics. Anyway, between the two wars, not many professors were interested in Proust.
Right.
Even immediately after the war, they were not interested much, I would say. So it started later and didn't stop.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I must say, sometimes. But that is it's the way we proceed. But I think everything is interesting by Stephen Hudson, by example. Stephen Hudson, for instance, which the real name is Sidney Schiff, has
Right. Okay.
the first piece about Celeste in 1925. So we published it. It's a sort of story, short story about Celeste, and everything is there. It's a very, very moving text. And the first one about that great figure. I think we owe her part of the book.
Yeah, as Proust himself said in one of the quoted in one of the essays in this book, I don't remember which one, but where he said, without Celeste, there wouldn't be this book. I couldn't work. Yes. I couldn't do this. So for our listeners, many of our listeners, I'm sure, are expert Proustians in their own right, and they already know all about Celeste, although there's more for them to learn in this. But could you maybe, for people who are tuning in with slightly less knowledge, could you talk to them a little bit about the figure of Celeste in Proust's life? And because she really is extraordinary, and the essays that touched on her in this book and her predecessor, Céline Cotin, c'est ça?
Yes.
That were fascinating, because you get this very intimate look at this man who, like all of us in the pandemic, was cooped up all the time, entirely devoted to his work, and these women were really singular figures in his life. So could you tell us a little more about them?
Yes, well, Celeste was the last of the motherly figures close to Proust, which were either maid or governess, or finally a sort of Celeste was all that, a governess, a maid, and a mother, to a motherly figure. She arrived, well, Proust used to know her husband much earlier.
Right.
He was a taxi driver, Odilon Albaret, whom Proust met in Cabourg in 1907. And then in 1913, when Céline Cotin had to retire, Odilon introduced a very young and very recent wife, who was completely lost in Paris. She has just married Odilon. She was very different from him. He was a rather robust man, strong man, but not probably very delicate. And she was from the country, the center of France, and not educated at all, but extremely refined and sensitive. And she has no culture at all. I think Proust made her culture, quoting to her pages of great authors.
Chateaubriand.
And finally, she talked like Proust at the end. She made huge sentences to express her both views. And so she started to make parcels, to send copies of Duchess one and so on when it was published. And when Céline retired, she took her appointment as a sort of maid. And sadly enough, Proust used to talk to her every night. When, for instance, when he came back from a dinner party, which was at midnight or 2 a.m., he used to tell her everything what happened, everything which was said during hours. But Celeste stood; she could not sit because it was not done at the time. So we had a complicated relationship, because she remained a servant, but she was also a maîtresse, or mistress, and she was not a wife, of course, but just a mother-like figure. And Proust couldn't stay alone. He could not stay alone because he was a sick man, but also because this kind of sensibility made him he had to have people around him. So not in his bedroom, but around. When it was all started, of course, in his early childhood with his relation with his mother. So, as he had lost his mother in 1905, he had to find other people. And with Celeste, he found somebody who could listen to him and understand him. And Franz Proust used to tell that Celeste talked to her like a master. She knew exactly what she would have said. And after Proust's death, as Proust had told her that later on, Celeste, everybody will come from around the world, students, academics, to ask.
He knew, yeah.
About me. He knew. Not many knew at the time. He knew. And then Celeste used to, in a small hotel, Rue des Canettes, she met all the visitors with great kindness and played a part, a number. It was almost always the same number, if it's the right word, son numéro.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the TV broadcast of Roger Stéphane, Portrait de Marcel Proust. You see a marvelous performance of everybody, but also of Celeste. And she had the same exquisite gesture of wiping her eye when she talks about Proust's death and so on. Yeah. And she was very moving till the end. And she contributed a lot to Proust's reputation or glory, and her book. Georges Belmont was translator from English. He has translated the ambassadors Henry James, for instance, had the idea of publishing in a book long interviews with Celeste. And it's a sort of autobiography, a biography of Proust, and Proust is more true than plus vrai que nature. The only point she didn't want to talk about is, of course, homosexuality.
Right.
So for her, it did not exist. Simply not. I met the same attitude in Proust's niece, Madame von Proust.
Oh, interesting.
This narrator did not think her uncle could have been an homosexual.
That's fascinating, and well, like his mother too, right? I mean, they all kind of
about him. No, I think I would not, of course, to say the contrary, but I think his parents knew. You know, we have published at the Société des Amis de Marcel Proust this year a small brochure publishing a letter from Proust with 17 to one of his friends of Condorcet, the lycée.
Oh, right.
Versini. And he says everything about his homosexuality. And he says, notably, that recently he had a meeting with a nasty boy who forced him to do things on the sofa. But he said, I was not completely forced. I agreed, or I did not, you know. And he had I told it to my father and to my mother.
Yeah.
And also to one of his friends. So I think she knew, and it's fascinating to see that in her letters she did not ever discuss the matter. She never said you should marry, for instance. You should. No. Once it happened with Anatole France's daughter, and Proust was furious and said, "But don't talk to me about that girl. Don't talk to me ever about marriage and so on."
Yeah.
He was not definitely my kind. I think his mother knew it.
Yeah,
And
no, she knew, but you're right that the idea that that's something that is for readers today, his sexual identity and his sexual outlook are such a point of interest for so many readers now. But for the people close to him, to have that be something that couldn't really be spoken about is very interesting.
I have always found very moving the kind of support the gay community has brought to Proust.
Yeah.
Even where he was no more famous or not yet, or he has it has been a very faithful public, because of course Sodom and Gomorrah one is a marvelous manifesto in favor of the persecuted minorities, homosexuals, Jews, and so on. And it's a marvelous piece. There is the longest sentence in his whole novel is about the persecution of the homosexuals across the world. I think one and a half. It's very moving, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's extraordinary, because it's that man who should have been very right-wing, very conservative, very and so on, and not saying the truth about himself, has taken the most brave postures in life about moral, political, and social realities. And of course, he had been very shocked by 2 or 3 scandals, as you know, the Wilde trial, and also the Olenbourg in Germany, the Olenbourg trial, and so on.
Which was like about 10 years after the Wilde trial, right?
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When he was starting to write Les Cahiers.
Yeah, no, it's really, one of the essays that I loved by one of the scholars that you assigned the essays to was the one about Wilde. I mean, it was about Proust, Gide, and Colette together, and this kind of the way that they always sort of missed each other, but appreciated each other. And I thought that was such a beautiful. I mean, that's a more classical. People might expect to see those 3 put together, as they sometimes are, but it was a really beautiful meditation, I thought, on how each of them approached sexuality in their work and in their life.
Yes, really. Because it is really the heart of his work.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, not only time, not only memory, but also sex.
Yeah, also sex. Now, I thought we might switch. Could we switch now to the famous, now famous 75 pages? This is just, I was so excited when I got my copy in the mail from Albertine, so thank you all. And you begin this volume with an essay, another beautiful and short essay, Le Moment Sacré, the sacred moment. So can you talk to us about what these pages are, what they are, what they mean for Proust's work, and then what was the sacred moment like for you when you first got to read these? As somebody who's one of the great specialists of Proust, to hold these in your hands had to have been an extraordinary experience. So I would love to hear you tell us more about that too.
Yes, we had waited for years for the publication or the rediscovery of those 75 feuillets, which are in fact more when printed than yes, it's a huge book with the marvelous editing by Nathalie Mauriac.
Yeah, she did an amazing job.
It's an amazing piece of work. But anyway, it's to try to be not too long. It's a story or tale by Henry James about Proust's novel, because when Proust died, as everybody knows, he kept everything. He kept it. He did that. His earlier pieces at school and so on. He kept everything.
Yeah.
Everything went to, in principle, to Proust's niece, Suzy Proust, but she had a mother. Who did not like at all the Prousts, because reading was forced on her, because she was the daughter of Adrien Proust's mistress. And Adrien Proust, in a very brutal way, forced his son, Robert, was a sergeant, to marry that lady. And when Robert, who has not been a very faithful husband anyway, died, she started to burn everything. And then, as you know,
horrible.
A great collection and libraire came at her and said, "My lady, don't burn all that. We will buy it." They bought a lot of things, and then Suzy was the real teenager, the niece, not her mother, asked for the whole thing, all which was left. Okay. And he kept it with great care and great love. And one day, after the Second World War, a young teacher called Barnard de Fallois came to see her, saying he was starting a thesis about Proust novel, and she trusted him. She gave it everything, all the papers, all the cahiers de brouillon, all the proofs, all the manuscripts, all went to Barnard de Fallois' flat, where I saw him, by the way. He was very kind to me and showed me some things at the time. It was, I think, 60 years ago, unfortunately.
Wow.
Then one day, Barnard de Fallois, who had published Jean Santeuil, the first novel by Proust in 1952, and Contre Sainte-Beuve, a sort of mixture of literary criticism and also novel, then stopped writing his thesis. And he was appointed as general manager in several publishing houses, Hachette, and so on. And then he started his own publishing house.
Fallois, yeah.
He died
recently, right?
2 years ago. He was, I think, 90 something, still very young and bright. But when he stopped writing his thesis, he gave back to Mrs. Proust, Proust's and niece, what he had received from her, but not the whole thing. As we discovered, and as I supposed for years, he kept things with papers with him. And it's like, and every Proustian tried to discover those papers, to read them, I tried to, and he said, no, I have nothing. It was like the Aspen papers, finally,
exactly.
More or less. And then when he died, we discovered, we saw that he had kept things, papers, and so on. And this was on Caisse Feuillet. He has talked about them in his preface to Contre Sainte-Beuve, but he had published even a small part of them, not very well, I must say, because it was not orderly done. It was Robert Le Chevreau, and then a piece about aristocratic names.
Right.
But it was not very well done. And then finally, we discovered that Nathalie Mauriac could get access to the feuillet, and we decided to publish it. And Gallimard, with the historic publisher of Proust, immediately agreed with the idea of publishing them. So it's a complete novel without even reading the feuillet. You have an extraordinary story of dishonesty, one must say, intellectual dishonesty, and also the psychology of a collector who can't tell he has that because people would ask, how did you get them? And finally, the rediscovery, the joy of everybody. Anyway, it's probably a good thing, because if it had been published in 50 something, nobody would have cared much.
I see.
In those years, you know, in France at least, it was Sartre, Camus, or later the Nouveau Roman.
Yeah, it was so opposite to everything Proust was.
A few thousand people would have cared about those unpublished material, but not many, I would say. Now, on the reverse, it's a good moment. Everybody is interested. And during that terrible period of the COVID, Proust was the champion du confinement.
Tout à fait.
He would never get out of his bedroom. It became again a very popular figure. Everybody tried to see how he could have stayed in his bedroom without being unhappy, and so on. So we were all happy to see that. And it has been a great success in France, I think, and also in many countries. And I have heard recently that it will be translated by at the Harvard University Press.
Oh, good. Okay.
So it will be published.
It will come in English sooner or later.
I hope 1 year or so, because it will take a little time. But so, what is it? Proust had always wanted to be a writer. He refused to take any appointment as a diplomat or so. And then but it's not easy to become a writer. So he started with small pieces and then wrote an unpublished novel called Jean Sanqueuil, 900 pages, I must say, but he was not happy about it. And everybody would have been happy with Jean Sanqueuil, but he was not. And he didn't talk about it to anybody and just kept it like the rest of his papers. And then he was at the time around under 30, roughly. He started to go to school again. He thought that he had to translate, to be a translator.
Oh, right.
At that time in France, every great writer thought that translation was the marvelous school. Gide has translated Conrad and Shakespeare, for instance. Martin Dugard has translated Dorothy Bessy, and Claudel has translated from Greek, and also Coventry Patmore. Everybody learned to write when translating.
By translating.
Yes, exactly. And then he translated Ruskin, as everybody knows. It took a long time because it was 6 years.
And he didn't really speak English, as we know. So.
No, he said that he didn't speak English, but he could understand Ruskin.
I love that.
And of course, her mother helped him. But when we can see now the first draft of Madame Proust and what Proust wrote, we can see that there is a difference. And as usual with Proust, he asked information to many people. He had read many books about art and so on to do his translation. But anyway, in 1905, he was already 34 and he had not written any novel. And then our mother died. His mother died. So it was a complete disaster, affective and artistic. He could not write. He had no valuable past behind him. And That was some terrible years in 1906 and 1907. In 1907, he has started writing articles for papers, marvelous ones, about les sentiments filiaux des parricides, impression de route automobile, and so on, 3 articles. And then probably at the summer 1907, he really started it all with the 75 feuillets, 75 pages. What was it? It started like an autobiography. It was like in more or less autobiography because he was saying je, I, but also because you can find in it the names of parents, Jeanne, or grandmother, Adele, and so on, the real names. So it is an autobiography. And it's important to notice it because it's probably the reason why he will stop again after the page 76. But we find one element of a novel with the figure of the future swan, named Monsieur de Bretteville. Bretteville is a name of a place close to Cabourg, where he was staying when he, and then it took roughly 6 months to write that. It's the first draft of Combray, the first part of Du Côté chez Swann, but also some pages about les jeunes filles, maiden, and some pages about the aristocratic names, like in the Côté de Guermantes Way, and also a few pages about Venice, like in Albertine disparue, the fugitive, and then he stopped. He stopped again. So it was terrible certainly for him. He couldn't go on, and he had another idea. It was, well, I don't succeed in writing a novel, so I will write some criticism about Sainte-Beuve. And then there was the Contre Sainte-Beuve, with part of narrative about his mother. And then he stopped again, didn't find any publisher. He went to see them and said, "What would you like to publish about Sainte-Beuve?" And they said no.
It's so reassuring for all writers to hear about those rejections.
And then again, during the summer 1909, he started it all again and never stopped.
Yeah.
He took again the 75 feuillets, the 75, and then increased them and changed the names, and became, in changing names, he became a novelist. Yeah. Instead of a diarist or an autobiographer, which he didn't want to be.
Right.
Because the paradox is that he used everything, as you know better than I, in his old life. Mm-hmm. Nothing is invented in my book, he said. Nothing is invented, and everything is a novel, part of a novel, with 500 characters. It's not a book about Marcel Proust. It's a book about 500 people at the beginning and finally about us.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Were there any things that you were particularly surprised by? So yes, so these 75 pages, it is like, you know, the seeds or the discarded skin of the snake that becomes the recherche. It's this amazing kind of source material for this unbelievable novel that we know and love. Were there any things that you were surprised to find in this, or what most surprised you to find in this?
Well, there are a lot of charming or intelligent or moving notations, sentences, and it's anyway. It's what surprises me. Anybody would have published them. I mean, if I had written that, I wouldn't have stopped. I mean, I would have gone to a publisher and said,
Yeah.
Written a marvelous book, please publish it.
Yeah.
But he was extremely exigeant. You
Yeah.
know, his marvelous sentence, I feel, and let us go further. Je sens et n'allons plus loin.
Mhm.
And it's a man who never stopped before having felt that he couldn't do more, or he could do better, and he had always to improve, even if it should take time, because he was already old for the time. He was 36. He's not old, but before the First World War, when the average age of death was 50. Mm-hmm. It was, anyway, he died at 50, 51.
Right. Yeah.
But it was already late. So it was extremely risky to stop. So I thought it was very moving. And there are figures who are fascinating. His grandmother, we saw her in Swan. But sure. Here she is quite natural, very pleasant, charming, and so on. And we can see that the grandmother is not the mother.
Right.
For a long time, people have thought that in the La Recherche de Pléiade, the character of the grandmother was really Jean Proust, the mother. Yeah. No, it's Adèle Berncastel. It is the charming and moving grandmother. And there is a mixture of humor, sadness, and sympathy in those pages, which are very moving. Mm-hmm. And also, it flows naturally. I mean, Proust is not difficult author. It's quite natural. It's a sort of, it flows like a river, like la Seine. Or like her son, je ne sais pas. So all that is there, and what we have not is the memory.
Right. Involuntary memory. Yeah.
Yes. We can propose the idea that it all started really when Proust had discovered the part of memory as a sort of principle of his novel. La mémoire volontaire. Not, it doesn't mean that everything has to go out from involuntary memory, but for the artist, the involuntary memory is the principle. Everything goes out of the cup of tea.
That view, like a Japanese,
yes. It's not true, of course. It didn't happen like that, but it is a marvelous device. Yeah. It is the invention of the device, because with the involuntary memory, we enter in the world of literature, of novel, of imagination, of everything is opened. The autobiography would have been much more restricted.
Yeah.
And then also the invention of Swan. Swan is not there.
Right.
Monsieur Bretteville
is totally nuts. Like you don't notice him at all. I think, I mean, there's so much I would like to ask you myself, but I'm getting some messages that we have many questions from your public. So could I, are you willing to take a few questions before we close?
Yes, or many if you want.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you all were messaging me before, Sandrine, Miriam. Can you send a question through? I'm not seeing any now.
Yeah, I can read a first question.
Oh, okay.
From Mr. Bruce Parks. Do you think Proust was anti-Semitic possibly in order to assimilate into French society? Another way to ask this question, Proust seems to have had a complicated relationship with the Jewish people, making most of it, not all of the Jewish characters in his work as unsympathetic. It is also well known that Proust was a pro-Dreyfus and confronted his friends who were not quite directly. To have such a complicated relationship is difficult to understand. In your studies of his life, what is your opinion?
Well, thank you for your question, which is a rather tricky one. As my favorite writer has written, Agatha Christie, we can change the future, but we cannot change the past. So what happened before the First World War is that Proust did not think he was a Jew. He has written to Robert de Montesquieu, my mother is a Jew, but I am a Christian. I've been baptized and I've done my première communion, my first communion. So that's the first point, and which is rather difficult because you can say, but it's not true and so on. Second point, I have asked that question a long time ago with the last figure of the Jewish Society, who have known the Proust family, and they told me that Proust had the anti-Semitism of the Jewish people, which is social. I mean, that lady, Madame René Mayer, was the wife of the former French Prime Minister of a Jewish family related to the Proust, told me, for instance, my parents used to say, don't go on that beach, there are too many Jews there. So it's a sort of, I regret it, I must say. I'm sorry about it, but I can't do anything about it either. Probably when Bloch performs his numbers, Proust probably had that kind of feeling. He was not completely, Bloch was too much. And he was inspired in a way by Maurice Finali, one of his friends. So I would say that that kind of anti-Semitism was social, mostly. Ça ne se fait pas, il ne faut pas se comporter comme ça. And it was not at all racist. And for the main things, Proust was with the Jews and with the homosexuals and with the sick people too, who were also a despised category of the society, and he was not against them. And when the problem rose, he was on the right side in the Dreyfus affair, for instance. And also, I must say that you cannot find in his letters anything against the Jews. And he had many good friends were Jew among his at school, later on with the Rothschilds and the Fould and many others, and nobody complained. Nobody complained about him. So I would say we must go back to that society of the 1910, who had no idea that somebody called Hitler or called Rosenberg would arrive, or called Pétain or Laval could ever come in our midst. I don't know if I have answered your question. So for me, Proust is not anti-Semitic. I regret some comic aspects of the Bloch figure, whom I would not have written myself, I must say. But it's probably for me, he tried to be funny, and it was also a sort of social despise.
No, and like you were saying before, that famous long sentence in Sodom, that's so moving, about where he's talking about the ways in which the Jews and the homosexuals of the world are persecuted, are not appreciated, are forced to hide. I agree with you. I also think it's important to remember that Proust was a very young man when he became a Dreyfusard, and we know that he was socially ambitious. We know that he wanted to be with the aristocracy, to meet people who were sort of socially prominent, and there was no social advantage to being an overt Dreyfusard in that world. It was absolutely, there was nothing he could gain from that, and yet he was, and courageously so. So I think it nuances the picture that we get when we think, because my students ask me this question a lot too. Well, if he was Jewish, why didn't he say it? Or why isn't the narrator Jewish? If he was gay, why didn't he say it in his writing? And I didn't know your favorite writer was Agatha Christie, but you're right. We can't change what that world was, but I think he deserves a little bit more credit than he sometimes gets when people assume that he was a self-hating Jew. Or
A question by Patricia Abel. In Time Regain, Proust announces that he is going to state the only real names in the book, the relatives of Françoise who help a widow after her husband's death in the war. Can you give some insight into his reason for this?
Well, it's true. I mean, the La Rivière existed. They were related to Celeste, and they did things very, very brave during the war. It's not true that it is the only real name. Some others happen to be also of real figures, as you know, but are in the book. Le Professeur de la Foi, many others are real figures, like Comtesse de Noailles,
Le Prince de Sagan.
Le Prince de Sagan, absolutely. Also the Louis-René de Gramont, the brother of the Duke, friend of Proust, and there are other figures. So it's what is interesting is that it says it's really a work of fiction. It's not because I talk about real people that I am not writing a work of fiction. You are in an imaginary world, not in a real one. But there is an exception, and it was written probably also to please Celeste.
Yeah, and what we didn't talk about when we were talking about Celeste was that she was actually helping him do his work every day. She was collating the pages, she was organizing. So yeah, she was, and she says in one of the articles in your book, you know, that book was too long for me, it was too big for me, I couldn't read the whole thing. But we have to believe that, you know, he was putting those things in there for her because she was looking at this material every day.
It's quite true. She couldn't read it, but she had made it.
Yeah.
It's quite true. Another question?
A question from Dominique Julien.
21h.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. How can we make sense of the multiple, successive, compulsive rewritings of similar scenes with different details and names in the 75 feuillets and other manuscripts?
What is the question?
How can we make sense of the multiple, successive, and compulsive rewritings of similar scenes?
Well, I think the main thing is the last état of the work, the last page, the last thing he has written, the last version is always the best. But when you read sketches, even if it is better, music or drawings, preparing a picture and so on, you understand more some things, either because you insist on some special point, or a more naive way of telling things help you when it is difficult. Same thing in poetry with Mallarmé, for instance, when you read the first sketches, you understand the last lines much better. Here also, you can understand more of the grammar, of village, of the country house, of that drama of the kiss of the mother, which comes or never comes, or comes not enough. You see, and there is a fascinating page here, which is also in Jean Santeuil, where Proust writes, my childhood was a well of sadness, a puits de tristesse, because that child seems extremely happy. He was wealthy, he had many people around him, he had all he wanted, affection and so on, love, and suddenly he feels extremely unhappy, a well of sadness. And that you can read it in this book of the Southern Gasfoyer. I think that to answer that question, sometimes, you know, very simple sentences throws a very strong light of the main points of our work. The well of sadness, how to fill that well of sadness.
Yeah.
To write is probably a way of filling the well.
Yeah. You're speaking of the grandmother. I was thinking about the image on where the narrator is on the beach in Balbec with his grandmother, and they meet the Princesse de Luxembourg, who treats them like zoo animals, and he says, you know, by a miraculous process of evolution, you know, my grandmother had become an antelope or something. And I think that, you know, we see this miraculous process of evolution too in reading these successive scenes. And you're right that, you know, he was such a great writer that things that he discarded, I would be thrilled to have produced. You know, just the expression "un puits de tristesse," it's so beautiful. So I think for those of us who can't get enough even of the thousands of pages of the recherche, there's always more to find in these other scenes.
Yeah, there's a point which is also present here is the sense of humor. All the scenes in the garden are very funny. About the Proust was a very great comic writer.
The best, yeah. Really, really funny too.
You can feel it here, even there.
Yeah.
And, more than perhaps in Jean Santeuil.
Yeah. Jean Santeuil is pretty humorless, no?
Yes. Sorry?
Oh, I said Jean Santeuil is fairly humorless, no? It lacks that.
Yes, right. It's much less funny than even the Southern Gasfoyer.
Yeah.
And much less funny than In Search of Time.
Maybe one last question. Sorry, we will be short of time. From Sylvia Lopez. What do you think about changing the characters Vinton to Vinteuil, turning a naturalist into a musician? Also, I have read a letter from Proust to Marie Nordingler, I think, where Swann was earlier thought as a mineralogist, and we know that Swann wanted to be an art essayist. What do you think about turning this character from the science field into the art field?
Well, probably it was a very interesting question at the other hour. So Proust was not much of a scientist. When he was in the last year of his lycée, in the class of philosophy, his teacher of physics wrote on his, the bulletin, ne fait absolument rien, does absolutely nothing. So, he probably didn't feel very happy about naturalists or scientists who couldn't write about things he didn't know from the inside. So he started with his naturalist, and finally he had the marvelous idea that in his novel, every art should be present. We have a painter, Elstier, we have a musician, Vinteuil, we have a novelist, Bergotte, even a sculptor called Ski.
Oh, Ski, yeah. And La Bernard for theater. Yeah.
La Bernard for the theater, and Rachel. Right. So every form of art should be present. So that's why we have a musician. And the other idea, of course, was to make one figure out of two, because we had the naturalist and also the musician, and finally it became one figure, the man and the artist. And they are also two, because you can never guess what the artist is when you meet the man.
Yeah.
I think, Caroline?
Oh no, I was waiting for you to I didn't
To
want to
close
speak
the
over
floor.
anyone.
Yeah, we are running short of time, so thank you all. Thank you to Caroline, thank you to Mr. Tadié. We are really happy by this event. I'm sure we will have other occasion to do events on Proust, maybe on the release in the US of the 75 Feuillets. It's a very good news. Or maybe for the number 2 of the Cahiers de L'Herne Proust.
Yeah, more of this, please. It's wonderful. I can't recommend it enough. It's just a superb set of discoveries. It's terrific.
And also for the next book of Caroline.
Which is not terrific right now. But yes, thank you so much for having us, and thank you, Professor Tadié. It was an honor to speak to you.
No,